Owen began with the only defense he could. If he wanted to save his client's life, he would have to try and prove Brandon Wilson was insane.
There was nothing that Brandon could gain. It was not robbery, it was not sex, it was not revenge. This was a totally clinical selection of an unknown person to offer as a sacrifice to God. And it seemed to me that any juror is going to look at that, is going to have questions in their own mind as to whether or not this person is at all, Brandon, was at all sane. The whole point was to use the incident itself to illustrate that this is just crazy conduct. You can't explain it any other way.
In a court of law, insanity is not a scientific or a moral state. In California, it has a clear legal definition. And from the beginning, the prosecutors knew their mission would be to prove that Wilson was a child murderer who was sane. Brandon Wilson was in custody within 2 days of the murder of 9-year-old Matthew Checchi.
It is odd, actually. It is, but it's the way things are. I didn't do it.
Wilson confessed, claiming he got a message telling him to kill. His guilt was not in question. His sanity was.
And correct me if I'm wrong, man. I don't want it to be this way. I wish it wasn't, but it is. Okay?
On January 14th, 1999, Wilson entered 2 pleas before the court. Guilty and not guilty by reason of insanity. Opening the door for a sanity hearing where a jury would ultimately decide if he would face the death penalty or be sentenced to a hospital for the criminally insane.
What happens on a sanity trial is that the defense goes first because they have the burden of proving that their client is insane.
Determining Wilson's sanity now was up to the forensic psychiatrists. Wilson was examined, analyzed, and given a battery of tests by a total of 5 mental health professionals.
What would you think it sounded like? It was God.
Legal insanity is a defense of last resort, used in a small percentage of cases because it is rarely successful.
It wasn't either.
The definition is not scientific, it is legal. Dr. Charles Rabner, independent of the defense and the prosecution, was one of the psychiatrists appointed by the court.
Mr. Wilson.
The state of California is interested in knowing what his mind was at the time. Did he know what he was doing was wrong? And if he did know it was wrong, could he have stopped himself if he tried hard enough? Essentially, that's it.
In order to determine his mental state, the psychiatrists studied everything from his sense of reality to possible brain damage. They were given the opportunity to study the Oceanside interrogation tape.
Artificial control.
Detective McDonough's questions about right and wrong became the focal point of the psychiatrist's evaluation. As the trial began, Wilson's use of LSD was discussed, as well as past psychiatric records.
My opinion was that although he suffered...
Dr. Rabner submitted to the court that Wilson's delusions didn't force him to kill Matthew, only justified it for him.
Nothing to prevent him from knowing or understanding.
Rabner's conclusion was that Brandon Wilson understood the nature of his act and killed because he wanted to. Defense attorney Kurt Owen hired expert Dr. Donna Zimmerman to examine Wilson.
My opinion is that Mr. Wilson...
She found evidence that Wilson was indeed insane. She felt that Brandon Wilson suffered from a psychotic disorder, which made him incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong.
What he'd done was wrong.
But testimony from a nationally famous expert for the prosecution, Dr. Park Dietz, was substantially different. On the stand, Dietz used the events following Matthew's murder to prove his assertion that Wilson knew full well what was right and wrong.
What does that kind of tell us?
He continued to flee, and at one point saw what he believed was an approaching police car, at which point he dove into a culvert in order to hide from the advancing lights and not be observed. When what he thought was a police car had passed, he then continued fleeing to the hotel, his motel room, and as soon as possible he got inside his motel room. He washed his hands, he washed the blood off the knife. So all of those aspects of flight, of trying not to be captured immediately, are an indication of his knowing that what he'd done was wrong.
Dietz went on to explain how the act of Wilson getting a haircut demonstrated his need to disguise himself, again demonstrating that he knew what he had done was wrong.
It's actually important that he acknowledged that he knew society would regard his actions as wrong, despite his having the opinion that they were somehow justified. That a defendant's merely having the personal opinion that what they're doing is right does not make it so if they recognize that society would condemn what they're doing.
Dietz also did not lend credence to the defense assertion that Wilson was mentally ill and could not understand right and wrong.
What's not true is that just because someone is sick, they're not responsible. The law requires not just that somebody be sick, but also that that sickness made them unable to know what they were doing or unable to know it was wrong.
The jury was getting an array of opinions, 5 different experts. Soon they would have to decide whom to believe and whether or not Wilson belonged in a hospital or a jail cell.
You solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give in the matter now pending before this
As the
court
trial
shall
to
be the
determine
truth,
his sanity
whole truth,
neared
and
its
nothing but the truth,
conclusion,
so help you God.
Brandon Wilson took
Thank
the
you. Please come
stand.
forward and take a seat in the witness stand.
He wanted to plead his own case. His defense attorney, Kurt Owen, hoped that his own words would reveal his insanity to the jury. In his closing arguments, prosecutor David Rubin characterized Wilson as someone who knew that what he did was wrong and killed for pleasure.
And he goes out. And we know by his actions, no matter how you approach this case, that he knows the nature and quality of the act. He understands the nature and quality of the act. And he can distinguish between right and wrong. Right and wrong because he knows it was legally wrong and he knew it was morally wrong as we, a community, see that. That's what I told you in an opening statement 2 weeks ago. I think this evidence more than proves this. Defendant Wilson is sane. And I'm asking you to so find. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rubin.
Defense attorney Kurt Owen used his closing arguments to rebut the prosecution and assert that Wilson was incapable of grasping right and wrong.
Mr. Rubin and I apparently completely disagree on where the battlefield in this case lies. It is not, I think I've said this before, whether the defendant appreciated that the objective standard of right and wrong, both morally and legally, society's standard, said what he was doing was wrong, both morally and legally. The point is that he did not and could not understand the moral nature and quality of the act. The
case now rested in the hands of the jury. After deliberating for 2 days, on September 28, 1999, the jury returned with a decision.
We, the jury, in the above entitled cause, find the defendant, Brandon H. Wilson, was sane at the time of the commission of the crimes charged in the information, namely, murder in the first degree in violation.
Prosecutors were gratified by the decision, but their work was far from over. They would now have to argue that Wilson deserved the ultimate punishment, death. And for that, the prosecutor would have to lay out the horrifying details of Matthew's murder and the effect on the loved ones left behind.
He will be brought in by God to the inner circle of law.
Up against this horror, Wilson's defense attorney spared nothing to try to save the life of a young man he believed was seriously mentally ill and deserved mercy. Brandon Wilson had been declared sane. Because he admitted in court he killed 9-year-old Matthew Checkey, he had to face one more trial, a proceeding to decide his punishment. Because Matthew was ambushed by his murderer, Brandon Wilson was eligible for the death penalty. Brandon Wilson then approached the stand.
Please state your full name and spell your last name for the record.
Brandon H. Wilson, W-I-L-S-O-N.
He wanted to speak on his own behalf. Kurt Owen tried to stop him, fearing he would talk himself into the death penalty. But Wilson's obsession with death could not be contained.
Yes.
He demanded to make a statement,
I have advised you
uninterrupted.
not to make a statement. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You wish to disregard my advice and make a statement anyway?
I do.
What is that statement, sir?
First of all, I'd like to say that I feel no remorse whatsoever for what I've done. I would do it again in a second if I had the chance. I've explained to you my position here. My whole purpose in life is to help destroy your society. You people are here as representatives of that society, and as such, you should do everything in your power to rid the world of me.
Thank you.
Execute me.
Thank you. That will be sufficient.
Mr. Rubin, any questions?
No, Your Honor.
You may step down, Mr. Wilson. Isn't both counsel, Mr. Wilson's present, Mr. Owen?
Families.
In closing, Kurt Owen begged the jury to show mercy and put Wilson in prison where he could be treated for his mental delusions.
From the beginning, the question has always been, why? Why? How could it happen? But there is treatment available for mental illness within the California Department of Corrections. Treatment that might well restore Brandon Wilson to the Brandon Wilson that used to live in Wisconsin. For this is a heartbreaking case. And your lives are never going to be the same either. Your lives are never going to be the same. You didn't ask for this job, but you were selected by Mr. Rubin and by me because we felt that you could take upon yourselves this incredible burden of trying to decide between life and death for Mr. Wilson. Now, there is no
The defense argued that with a sentence of life in prison, Brandon Wilson could be treated for his mental illness. But prosecutor David Rubin argued that treatment for Brandon Wilson was not the issue.
This defendant was at the time. So he's treatable. So what? We're not here to determine if he's treatable. We're here to determine what's the punishment here. What do we do with him? What do you want to say to him? I mean, here's a fact.
On October 6th, the jury of 12 people came back with its unanimous decision. Brandon Wilson was sentenced to death. After asking the court to execute him, the jury granted Brandon Wilson's request.